A lot of people think that what Gary and I talk about is crazy and we're like the only two people on Earth that think this way or talk this way. It turns out we're not. So this is actually a great study that was done by Jeff Volek and Steve Phinney, among others. Steve Phinney's here, by the way, so if people want to talk to the world's expert on this, Steve is actually in the audience. This was a study that looked at 20 obese patients. These patients were randomized into two groups. The first group was on a carbohydrate-restricted diet. The second group was on a low-fat diet. So you had low-fat, high-carb, low-carb, high-fat. And you can see here what their differences were at the beginning, no difference, and at the end, which is to say that these guys were basically eating all fat and cholesterol. These guys were eating all carbs. Next slide. So what happened after 12 weeks? Well, after 12 weeks, not only did the group on low-carb, high-fat lose more weight, but they lost more fat. And not only did they lose more fat, but they lost more fat in the places we want to lose fat, which is in the abdomen. Now, I won't share the results with you today because I don't have the time, but one of the things I've done is I've chronicled my journey is use technology called Dexa, which is basically a CT, it's more of an X-ray that you get that is the gold standard for determining where fat is on your body down to the gram. In fact, I have a lipoma on my left arm, which is one of those little fat cysts. I know that I have more fat on this arm than this arm by a few grams, probably as a result of that lipoma. But through Dexa scans, they were able to, in fact, infer exactly where the fat was being lost. So not only were they losing more weight, they were losing more fat. Not only were they losing more fat, they were losing more fat from the places you want to be losing fat. Okay, well, let's stop here for a moment. How many times have people heard the argument, you know, those low-carb, high-fat diets, sure, you lose a lot of weight, but gosh, I mean, you're killing yourself. You're still going to give yourself a heart attack. All right, let's see. So, by the way, my wife last night took a look at the original version of this slide and said, oh no, that's way too complicated. So this is the simple version. I just want to share with you two things here, which is if you look at the high-density cholesterol level in the low-carb, high-fat group, it rose significantly more than that in the low-fat group. So this notion that if you eliminate fat, you will raise your good cholesterol, turns out not to be true. If you look at circulating levels of TAG, stands for triacylglyceride, we use that term interchangeably with triglycerides, you can see that they had a far greater reduction than the low-fat group. Again, think about what I'm saying here for a moment. These people just ate fat. These people ate no fat. These people have no fat circulating in their blood. These people do, albeit less, but still. There's more details around this. I think what I'm going to do is instead turn this into, I'll discuss something later. Okay, next slide. You might ask the question why and how. This is an interesting experiment that they did on those subjects both before and after the intervention. So the dark line shows what these patients had a response to a fat meal before. So this is a standard test you do where that little arrow is at time 0, you inject, effectively orally give the person a standardized dose of fat. And what you look for is what is the result in the body? How much of that fat immediately goes into circulation over a period of time? Now you can see that the black circles and the black triangles show you where these people were before any intervention was made. And you can see in both cases they had about the same response. After the study was done, look at the low-fat group. This is a group that's been not eating any fat. Now you give them fat, and all of a sudden you can see that they're basically the same. Statistically, there's no difference between these curves. So that means that when these people ate a fat meal, it mobilized through their body just as it did before. And you don't want that. You don't want to see these triacylglycerides in your blood. Whereas these people had a statistically significant reduction. And again, this is so counterintuitive. How can eating fat not make you fatter? How can eating fat not increase circulating fat? And it has to do with the hormonal environment that's created by the avoidance of fat. When you restrict carbohydrates, you turn the body's preferential fuel into fat and not carbs. I like to think of sugar in particular, but simple carbs in general, as the metabolic bully. When they come in your body, they sort of take over and they say, to hell with everybody else, this is all you care about, you're going to burn sugar. So you're going to take any fat you eat, we're going to store it as fat. Any excess carbohydrate you eat, we're going to store it as fat because you're going to be dependent on this simple thing. Okay, next slide. There's also other really well-known scientists here. Ronald Krauss, who's up at Berkeley, who's considered by many to be the world's authority on lipids, recently came out in a series of 3 papers, actually, but I just wanted to show you one of the abstracts here, which was a meta-analysis, again, an enormous study that looks at every study that's been done on this topic, and concluded that during the 5 to 23 years of follow-up in 350,000 patients, intake of saturated fat was not associated with an increased risk of heart disease, stroke, cerebral vascular disease. This paper came out last year. Okay. Next slide, please. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time going through my own personal experiment. I'm going to cover 2 components of it, and we'll get to that in a second. Okay. So when I started this experiment a couple of years ago, I was kind of interested in doing it for 2 reasons, what I would call the defensive reasons and the offensive reasons. Now, I think a lot of us do think about the defensive reasons, and rightly so, which is, how can I change the way I eat to reduce my risk of heart disease or stroke or diabetes or cancer or Alzheimer's disease? On the plane coming up from San Diego today, I sat next to a woman who saw me reading an article on polyunsaturated fatty acids and said, started talking to me. And it turned out this woman has been like a carb-restricted fiend for 32 years because Alzheimer's is in her family. And she acknowledges, she calls Alzheimer's disease brain diabetes. I found this quite progressive. So again, we all have our own reasons. Fortunately, a lot of these diseases aren't in my family, but boy, is this one ever. But there's also offensive reasons to consider this. Wouldn't it be nice to have more energy, improved mental acuity, better body composition, be able to perform better athletically for those of us that really care about that kind of stuff? Okay. So this was me at 30. A lot of people look at this picture, they don't actually recognize me. Am I morbidly obese? No, but if you consider that I was exercising 4 hours a day and eating all the right stuff. So I was not a candy bar eating guy. I mean, I was swimming like a fish and working out like crazy and trying to eat the right stuff. But I weighed 200 pounds and my body fat was 25%. So that means I had 50 pounds of fat on me. So by BMI, I was not obese. I was 1 point under obesity. But given that I was 30, I wasn't on a great path. This is me a few hours later. I managed to shed 5 pounds. Fortunately, more of that was fat, so I was down to only 40 pounds of fat. My wife insists I point out here that she's 7 months pregnant, and I'm not, but I think you would have figured that out. So this is my natural state. So in 2009, after I finished swimming the Catalina Channel for the second time, next slide, please. My wife said something to me very kindly, which was something along the lines of, you should start thinking about being a little less not thin. So I took a moment to realize what she was saying, and I said, I agree, so what are we going to do? So started just poring over everything I could read, and the only thing that jumped out at me, because I hadn't read Good Calories, Bad Calories yet, and Why We Get Fat wasn't yet out, was sugar couldn't be good for me. So I made this change in September 2009, which was 6 days out of the week I wasn't going to eat any sugar or high fructose corn syrup. 1 day a week I'd eat whatever the heck I wanted. Okay. So that went pretty well, and I'm going to show you in a moment what the outputs were along the way. By March of 2010, I was kind of like pretty happy with the results, and I thought, why don't I take another step? Why don't I go from 1 day a week where I can eat sugar to just 1 meal a week? And why don't I switch my white products to brown products? So I switched to the brown rice. I started buying the $87 a loaf Julian bread and all this kind of. Your grocery bill does go up. I will, full disclosure up front, if you want to eat better, you're going to pay more. And I started to like that. And in January of this year, and I'm going to spend a lot of time mostly focusing on here because it's really only during the last year that I had access to some of the remarkable data that I could analyze myself with in terms of blood chemistry, I decided to reduce starch to 1. So this is, now we're only into good starches. Now I decided let's take the starches down to 1 serving a day. So my overall carbohydrate went from about 600 down to 200 grams per day, but I still consumed fruits and vegetables in an unrestricted manner. And anybody who saw me eat fruits and vegetables would acknowledge it was a truly unrestricted manner. And then in May of this past year, I took the final leap of faith with the help of Gary standing on the sidelines saying, I can't wait to see this, and Steve, who's here, and Jeff. I decided to adopt what we would call full nutritional ketosis, which is to say, completely changing your body from being dependent on carbohydrates and glycogen, and your brain, by the way. Remember, your brain can only burn 2 things, glucose and ketone bodies. So if you take that last step, which I took in May, you basically said, we're done with sugar, right? We're done. Now it's all ketones, which means all that fat gets broken down into ketones and away we go. Okay. So what happened? Well, let me show you a bit of what I ate in terms of breakdown. So in January of this year, I was eating about 3,000 calories a day, and you can see that about a quarter of them were carb, a quarter were protein, a little under half were fat. I did that through to this period here, and you can see that in May of this year, I kept the calories about the same. And by the way, I'm never counting calories. I just sort of eat what I want, but I'm pretty meticulous about doing so when I'm experimenting. So I will take photographs of everything I eat. I will weigh it. I will send it to a third-party entity who does an analysis on it. So I'm trying to be as robust as possible to actually quantify what I'm doing, not because I believe that's necessary, but because I actually want to be accurate when I tell this story. And it turned out I was eating about the same. I would say that the difference between 3,050 and 3,150 is effectively nil. But you saw that I increased fat slightly, decreased carbs slightly. And then in the entry to ketosis, and again, not through deliberate effort, it just turned out I started eating a heck of a lot more in terms of overall calories, though the mass of food actually was less. So here, today I'm eating a little bit more than this. Actually, last time I checked, which was 2 weeks ago, I was at 5,100 calories a day. But at the time I did this slide, I was at 4,500 calories a day. But you can see that it's virtually all fat. So 3% of my energy comes from carbohydrates. None of those are starches and sugars, and I'm going to show you in a moment what I eat. A little bit from protein. Gary alluded to this earlier. One of the challenges I had when entering ketosis is I ate too much protein. You can see that all my life I've pretty much eaten 250 grams a day of protein. The thinking being, I exercise so much, I'm always breaking down muscle. I need those amino acids to replace them. I came to learn through Steve and Jeff that when you become ketotic, your need for protein actually goes down significantly. So you can see I eat about half the amount of protein I used to. Perhaps if we have time, I can go into a little bit more detail about why that's the case. Okay, so how did this all impact me? So let's start talking results. So getting these Dexa scans, which are these little x-rays that scan your body and tell you how much of your weight is bone marrow, how much of your weight is lean tissue, how much of your weight is fat, where that fat is, how much is on the right leg versus the left leg, and blah, blah, blah. You can sort of see my trajectory over the last 2 years, which is, obviously I've lost 25 pounds, but I think what's more important is what kinds of pounds have I lost. So when I started this experiment, 195 pounds, 156 of it was lean, 40 of it was fat. Today, so that's about 20% body fat. Today, or I guess last month, my weight's about 170, but all of that loss has been fat. So I've preserved my lean tissue, but I've lost fat, and that's reflected in my body fat being closer to what it was in high school. Okay. Let's think about what I just told you. I increased my calories from 3,000 to 4,500, and I didn't exercise anymore, but I lost weight. Now, if this calories in equals calories out, meaning the only thing that matters is the calories you eat, is true, how can this be possible? Well, I think you can guess that I'm saying it's not possible. But here's a sort of schematic way to think about it. There's really 4 buckets in my mind that account for where calories go. Because we all agree thermodynamics has to be preserved, right? We all learn that. You can't create or destroy energy. So if I'm eating a given amount of energy, it's got to be taken away. Well, these are sort of the 4 things that get rid of it. So the first is digestion. It actually requires some energy to digest food. Now, not all foods are equal, and some foods require more. But take my word for it that it's a relatively small amount. Okay. Then you have this thing called activities of daily living. That's what we do, right? That's sort of walking to the grocery store, picking up the bag, doing, et cetera. And this one's highly variable amongst people. There's no doubt about that. When I was in high school working construction jobs, that was a big box. I'm a desk jockey now, so it's a small box. There's exercise, which is kind of that deliberate amount of energy we burn when we are sweating it out at the treadmill or doing whatever we do. For me, that's a pretty large amount, but again, it's always been a large amount. And then there's your resting metabolic rate, and it turns out this is probably the most important one. These are the calories you burn when you sleep, when you drive, when you watch TV. For most of us, these are the calories that account for our combustion of fuel during the majority of the day. This is approximately what I looked like when I was on sort of a low-fat, high-carb diet. And you can measure these things, by the way. You can do something called a metabolic cart where you can get a pretty good estimate of this, et cetera. This is what I look like today, broadly speaking. So my daily caloric intake has ramped up, but I'm still actually in a little bit of a calorie deficit. So I'm not really expending more energy in digestion or in daily living, and I'm certainly not exercising more. But my resting metabolic rate has gone up. In other words, I burn more calories when I sleep when I sit down, when I drive, all the other times of the day. So how is that? Well, it has to do with this, right? When you reduce the level of insulin in your body, you shift the partitioning of fuel so that your body gets more energy to burn from the fat cell. So I shifted my metabolic substrate of preference from glycogen, which is where most of us reside, to fat. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I think you've at least agreed that for an n equals 1, eating a lot of fat and very few carbohydrates can make you lean. But the question is, am I healthy? Because if you think about it, there were really two, even though I kind of wanted to not be, big anymore, I also wanted to, I have this concern about, the heart disease that's in my family. So let's take a look at that. So how do you assess cardiac risk? This is actually not the simplest thing in the world to explain. Most physicians and cardiologists will look to something called a Framingham risk score. And I would say that it's a reasonable place to start. So let's start with it. The Framingham risk score gives you a whole bunch of points depending on your age, your cholesterol in total, your HDL, that's the high density lipoprotein, that's the good cholesterol, your blood pressure and things like that. And you put all those things in and it spits out a score, and that score represents your probability of an adverse cardiac event, meaning something bad happening in your heart, in the next 10 years. Okay. When I started this out, my Framingham score was 8%. Now you got to remember something. For someone in his 30s to have a Framingham score of 8% is wildly upsetting. I mean, that's like 1 in 12 people. I mean, that's totally unacceptable. Okay. I have since come to realize that as valuable as that is, there are actually far more predictive and important things to consider. And going back to our friend Krauss, he would argue that it's these 3 things that are actually far more important. And the unfortunate part is you can't glean these from a standard cholesterol test. So in a moment I'm going to explain how you would actually assess these. But if you look at a very special kind of cholesterol test called a VAP panel, you can actually get this information. So he talks about a subset of HDL that's too low, your triglycerides being too high, and a subset of your LDL being too high. That's the risk. And again, when I started this experiment, I failed on all 3 of these metrics. So in other words, there's no dispute that I was not in the right spot. Today, I pass all 3 of these with flying colors. But let's take a look at that. Next slide, please. So using a standard cholesterol panel, this is the garden variety cholesterol panel you'll get when you go to your doctor. This is how my cholesterol has changed over 2 years. If nothing else, I want to just show you this is confusing. So when I started out, I had a normal cholesterol at 175. And believe it or not, even an LDL of 113 was not pulling the trigger on it. But the HDL of 31 was a profound risk factor. In fact, any HDL under 40 is deemed high risk. Now, if you look at me today on the standard cholesterol panel, because today I always get VAP panels and standard cholesterol panels side by side so I can compare them just for giggles, you'll see that my total cholesterol is about the same, right? Went from 175 to 164. My LDL is really small now, it's 59, and my HDL is 85, so it's almost tripled. Now, in a moment we're going to go into more detail on this, but it's worth pointing out that my cardiologist, who's a wonderful guy because he completely tolerates all of my obsessive self-experimentation, was blown away by this. But what really blew him away was what I'm going to show you in a moment, which was the subparticle analysis. Okay. So does anybody here know how they actually measure all these levels in your blood? Yeah, I mean, I certainly didn't know this. So I always thought these were like real numbers, right? So it turns out when they draw the blood in the serum separator tube and away they go to the lab, they measure total cholesterol. Okay, great, so that we know that. They don't really measure HDL. They use this manganese precipitate and they get it to fall out of solution and they estimate your HDL. So when you get a standard cholesterol panel, the HDL number isn't actually exactly measured. Okay, fine. They do measure the triglycerides, so check, that's good. Here's the real killer. They don't actually measure LDL. Remember the bad cholesterol? They don't really measure it, they estimate it. So what they do is they say, well, we know that LDL is what's left over out of total cholesterol, high density lipoprotein, and then all the VLDLs, ILDLs, all the intermediate guys. That's about 1/5 triglycerides. So they take total cholesterol, subtract out this estimated HDL, and subtract out 1/5 triglycerides. Now, I'm being a bit glib in saying this. There is a theoretical reason why you would acknowledge that 1/5 of your triglycerides represent those things. It just turns out to be wrong most of the time. So if for no other reason than these numbers aren't accurate, I firmly believe in one of the two, there's clinical assays that can measure this, but one of them is called a VAP, which is the one I do. But the other reason is that it actually gives you far more detail on this. So I've color-coded this in a way to say that the green things really matter and you really want them to be high. The red things really matter and you really want them to be low. The blue things, we don't really care about. And the black things are second order in my mind. So yeah, you really want triglycerides to be low. You really want the small, dense LDLs to be low. So remember that whole LDL thing being bad? That's only partially right. It turns out it's only the small, dense ones that are bad. The big, buoyant ones aren't really bad. That whole thing about HDL being good, that's sort of true, but really it's only one component of HDL that actually protects you. The other one doesn't really do it. And then there's these other two guys I won't go into today, but they're pretty remarkable as well. Okay, next up. So now let's just take a look at the last 4 months of my life. And I put these little pie charts here to remind you of what I did during this period of time. From April until August, I not only increased my total caloric intake from 3,000 calories a day to 4,500 calories a day, I went from eating about 200 grams a day of fat to 450 grams a day of fat, which, by the way, most of it's saturated. I mean, I just inhale saturated fat, as Sean can attest, over lunch today. So what happened? Okay, so the remnant lipoprotein, which I only include this so you can see the total number here, didn't change. Okay, big deal. It's already pretty low anyway. The small, dense LDL, this is the bad guy, which, by the way, you want these numbers less than 40. I was already there, eating a modest amount of fat, but then eating super amounts of fat, it didn't change. The large, buoyant LDL, this is the one that actually doesn't harm you, which was very small, doubled. So remember, my total LDL went up. Remember what I said way, way, way back at the very beginning about this whole observational thing about how it was observed that when you ate saturated fat, your LDL went up? That's true. Problem is, back then they didn't have VAP panels. They didn't appreciate this fact that, yeah, your LDL goes up, but it's not the part that you care about. Okay.